The dream came to Jon Snow like a wound reopening. He was ghost before he knew he was sleeping, low to the frozen ground. Red eyes cutting through the dark between the trees. Nose full of blood and smoke and something wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong in the way that only the wolf dreams carried. That bone-deep wrongness that had no human word attached to it. He ran. The great white direwolf ran south through forests that blurred and shifted. And somewhere in the dream there was grey fur too, grey wind. Robb's wolf, circling and circling a stone building near a river. Hackles raised, teeth bared at walls that would not open. The howling that came from grey wind was not the howl of a wolf on a hunt. It was grief. It was warning. It was a sound Jon had never heard from any living creature and hoped never to hear again. He woke in his black wool with his hand already on Longclaw's hilt. The camp of the Night's Watch beyond the wall was still dark. The brothers sleeping around gutted fires. The cold so deep it had weight. Jon lay still for a long moment and stared up at a sky full of stars that felt indifferent to everything below them. The dream was already fraying at the edges the way dreams do. But the wrongness remained. It sat in his chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples out through his ribs. He told himself it was nothing. He had told himself that 3 nights running. On the 4th night, grey wind was trapped inside the walls and the howling stopped mid-cry, cut off like a candle pinched between fingers. And Jon sat upright in the dark with his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat and knew, with the certainty that had no logic behind it, only the blood knowledge that the Starks carried in their bones, that something was going to happen to his brother. Not had happened. Was going to happen. He still had time. Maybe. He left before dawn without permission, without orders, without anything except Longclaw and Ghost, padding silently at his heels. And the name of the twins turning over and over in his mind. He had heard it from a ranger 2 weeks past. Robb Stark rides to the Freys for a wedding, to mend what Robb himself had broken. Jon had filed it away the way you file away news of a world you've renounced. He was a man of the Night's Watch. He had taken his vows. But Robb was his brother, his king, and the dream had smelled like a slaughterhouse. He rode hard enough to kill a lesser horse. Ghost ran beside him in near silence, occasionally vanishing into the tree line and reappearing half a mile ahead. Always southward, always urgent. The direwolf did not need to be told where they were going. Jon stopped only to water the horse and eat cold-dried meat in the saddle. And he did not let himself think too carefully about what he was doing. Desertion from the Night's Watch carried one penalty, and he knew it well. Had helped carry it out himself, because if he thought about it he would find reasons to stop, and the dream would not let him find reasons to stop. He crossed into the Riverlands on the 3rd day, the land growing softer and greener, and louder with the sounds of a world at war, even in its quieter moments. Distant cook fire smoke, abandoned farmsteads, a bridge with the bodies of 3 men still hanging from a makeshift gallows, crows circling without enthusiasm. The war had eaten this land down to the bone. He asked a river trader about the twins and got a long, considered look in return. The man said the Stark wedding party had arrived 2 days past, said the Freys seemed welcoming enough, said there'd been music and the smell of roasting meat, and he hadn't thought much of it. Jon thanked him and rode harder. He smelled it before he saw it. The twins rose from the river in the grey afternoon light. The 2 squat castle towers connected by their bridge, and the smell coming downwind was copper, and smoke and an undertone of something that made Ghost press low to their ground and growl continuous and low. The sound of screaming, when the wind shifted, came next. Not one voice. Many. He didn't stop to plan. There was no time for planning. He crested the rise, above the approach to the castle gate, and took in what was in front of him in a single rapid sweep. Stark soldiers dying in the courtyard. Frey men in mail cutting them down from behind. The banners of House Frey hanging where the direwolf should have been. And through the great hall's high windows the flicker of torchlight and the shadows of violence moving against the walls. Ghost launched himself forward without being told. Jon drew Longclaw and followed his wolf into the chaos with his teeth set and his heart cold in the way it went. Cold in battle, not numb, but clarified, Everything narrowed. To the next threat and their next breath and the name he was screaming. Above the noise of dying men. Robb! Robb! The Frey soldiers at the gate turned. Toward the sound of a lone man on a horse riding. Directly at them with a white direwolf the size of a pony already among them. And for a moment, just a moment, something that might have been fear crossed their faces before training took over, and they raised their weapons, and Jon Snow, bastard of Winterfell, oathbreaker, brother, and fool, crashed into the red wedding like a stone, through thin ice, and prayed to every god in every September and Godswood that he was not already too late. If you want to see more what if stories like this one, hit that subscribe button and drop a character or moment you'd want explored in the comments below. The Great Hall of the Twins was a vision of hell, rendered in torchlight and stark colors. Jon took it in through the chaos of the threshold. The long feasting tables overturned, the floor slick with wine, and blood that had already begun to mix into something darker than either. The bodies of Stark soldiers cut down where they sat, still holding cup, some of them, killed between one breath and the next before the betrayal had fully registered on their faces. The musicians in the gallery above had stopped playing. The rains of Castamere still hung in the air like smoke from a fire that hadn't finished burning. He had fought through the outer courtyard with Ghost clearing the way, the direwolf moving through Frey soldiers like a white wind, not killing but disabling, a jaw clamped on a sword arm, a shoulder driven into a man's chest with enough force to crack ribs. The sheer animal terror of something that large and that fast moving through men who had expected no resistance from a dead camp. Jon had followed in Ghost's wake, Longclaw, taking 2 men at the gate and a third who came at him from the side with a spear. And then he was through the doors, and inside, and the noise hit him like a physical thing. He saw Robb. His brother was on his feet near the far end of the hall, which meant he was alive, which was the only thing that mattered for that first raw second. Robb Stark, the young wolf, king in the north, was bleeding from his left side, where a crossbow bolt had caught him, his sword drawn, standing over Talisa's body with an expression on his face that Jon had never seen before and hoped never to see again on any living person. It was the face of a man who had already died and hadn't finished falling yet. 3 Frey soldiers were circling him with the careful patience of men who knew their prey was wounded and had nowhere to go. Lord Walder Frey sat in his high seat at the end of the hall like a spider at the center of a web, ancient and satisfied and watching Robb Stark bleed with small wet eyes that held no more feeling than river stones. Bolton's man, Roose, Jon recognized him from descriptions. That still careful face that gave nothing away stood nearby with a wine cup. Unhurried, Jon crossed the hall at a dead run, the first of the 3 soldiers circling. Robb turned at the sound of boots on stone and caught Longclaw across the collarbone before he'd finished turning. The second came in fast and low, and Jon took the blow on his forearm, a shallow cut that burned bright and immediate, and drove his elbow into the man's face hard, enough to feel something give, then put him down with a pummel strike to the temple. The third was already swinging at Robb, who parried badly with his wounded arm, and Jon got his blade up in time to deflect the strike but not stop it entirely, the impact jarring all the way to his shoulder socket. Robb stared at him with those already dead eyes. Jon. Not a question. Not relief. Just the word, falling out of him like something he'd stopped believing in. We are leaving, Jon said. He grabbed his brother's sword arm, the good one, and pulled. Now, don't look at her. Look at me. Look at me, Robb. Robb looked at him. Something behind his eyes flickered, steadied, did not quite come back to life but found enough purchase to function. Ghost came through the hall doors behind them with 2 Frey soldiers stumbling back from his path, and across the hall Jon could hear Walder Frey's voice rising in outrage, thin and ancient and furious. Kill them both. Don't let them reach the door. And the hall was suddenly full of motion again, men moving from the walls and the gallery above. And Jon understood with cold clarity that they had perhaps 30 seconds before the numbers became simply impossible. Grey wind, Robb said suddenly. and the flicker behind his eyes sharpened into something desperate. They have him in the kennels, they. Ghost. John looked at his direwolf. There were no words for what passed between them. There never were. But Ghost turned and bolted back through the doors they'd come in. And John had to trust the wolf understood, because there was no time for anything else. He pulled Robb toward a side passage he'd marked on his way in, a servant's corridor half hidden behind a tapestry of House Frey's ugly sigil, and they went through it with Frey crossbowmen already raising their weapons in the hall behind them, a bolt cracking into the stone doorframe as they cleared it, close enough that John felt the displaced air on his cheek. The corridor was dark and smelled of old stone and kitchen grease. John kept moving, kept his hand on Robb's arm, kept listening behind them for the sound of pursuit. Robb ran beside him without speaking, which was its own kind of terrible. Robb had always talked in a crisis, thinking out loud the way their father never had, the words helping him arrange the chaos into something manageable. His silence now was the silence of a man running on the last of something. They came out through a kitchen exit onto the riverbank. The water blackened fast in the evening grey, the sounds of slaughter still audible through the castle walls. Ghost was there, and beside Ghost, pressing low against the direwolf's flank with blood, on his grey muzzle and a wildness in his yellow-green eyes that spoke of men who had gotten too close. Grey wind. Robb made a sound that had no name. He dropped to his knees in the mud of the riverbank and grey wind was on him. Immediately, enormous head pressing into his chest, and Robb's hands went into the wolf's fur and stayed there, shaking. John stood over them both with Longclaw, drawn, and watched the castle walls and gave his brother 15 seconds because 15 seconds was all either of them had. Robb. He kept his voice low and even. There are horses. Across the river there are horses. I left mine tethered at the mill. Can you ride? Robb lifted his head. The crossbow bolt was still in his side. His face was white beneath the blood and the torchlight from the castle. Windows painted everything in shades of red. He looked at John with the eyes of a man taking inventory of himself from a very great distance. Yes, he said. I can ride. It was, John would think later, the bravest thing he ever heard his brother say. They rode through the night without stopping. John set the pace, hard enough to open distance, careful enough not to founder the horses, on dark roads that were little better than mud tracks, through the riverland's exhausted farmland. Robb rode beside him in silence, upright through what had to be sheer will alone, the crossbow bolt still jutting from his left side at an angle that made John's teeth ache every time he looked at it. He hadn't pulled it, pulling it on horseback, in the dark with no maester and nothing to pack the wound with would kill Robb faster than the bolt itself, and John had learned enough from ranging beyond the wall to know that sometimes the wound staying closed was the only thing keeping a man alive. Ghost and grey wind ran flanking them on either side of the road, two shadows among shadows, occasionally visible only as the pale flash of Ghost's coat or the brief yellow gleam of grey wind's eyes, catching some stray light. Together the wolves were something ancient and unnerving moving through the dark Riverland's night, and twice they passed through the outskirts of Frey patrol camps. John saw the cook fires through the trees, and neither patrol stirred, because whatever the wolves radiated in the darkness was enough to keep men close to their fires and their prayers. John was grateful for small mercies. When the sky began to lighten towards a grey and grudging dawn, he found them shelter in the shell of an abandoned mill 2 miles off the main road. The wheel long rotted away, the interior smelling of damp wood and old grain and the ghost of industry. He got Robb off the horse and onto the cleanest patch of floor he could find. And then he looked at the bolt properly, for the first time in full light, and said nothing about what he saw. Tell me, Robb said. His voice was steady. That stark steadiness, their father's voice in both of them. It's deep but it missed the lung, John said, which was true. I need to take it out. Then take it out. John used the blade of his dagger, cleaned as best he could with the water from his flask, and strips torn from the lining of his cloak for packing. And Robb looked at the far wall throughout and made almost no sound. One sharp exhale when the bolt came free, one long slow breath after, and then the steadiness again. That terrible stark steadiness that their father had worn the same way. Like armor over something that was breaking underneath. When it was done, John sat back on his heels and looked at his brother. Robb looked older than he had any right to. He was 20, the same age John was. But the last year had put a decade on him, in the set of his jaw, in the way his eyes moved, in the particular quality of his exhaustion, which was not the exhaustion of a man who needed sleep, but of a man who had been spending something irreplaceable for a very long time and was running short of it. He was king in the North. He had been king in the North at 16, leading men 3 times his age into battles that no one had expected him to win. And he had won them. And it had cost him exactly as much as it looked like it had cost him. "She's dead," Robb said. Not a question. He'd seen it. He knew. "Yes," John said. There was no softening it, and he didn't try. Robb was quiet for a long moment. Grey Wind lay with his head across Robb's legs, eyes open, watching his face. Outside the mill, the dawn birds were starting up, indifferent and bright. "My lords," Robb said quietly. "My bannermen, Daisy Mormorn, Small John Umber." He said the names the way you account for the dead, methodically, giving each one its proper weight. "How many got out?" "I don't know," John said honestly. The outer courtyard was chaos. Some of the men camped outside the walls. May have broken away when the killing started. I can't say how many. Robb absorbed this. "Bolton was in the hall. I saw him." Something moved behind Robb's eyes, cold and very deliberate, and nothing like the boy John had grown up with. He was part of it. "Yes. He'll move on Winterfell." Robb said it flatly, working it out as he said it, the military mind still functioning even through everything else. "He'll want to consolidate the North before I can rally anyone. He'll have Lannister backing. Frey men." He paused. "He'll call himself Warden of the North." "Probably," John said. "Then we don't have time." Robb moved to rise and John put a hand on his shoulder. Not forcefully, just enough. "You have a hole in your side that I packed with cloak lining," John said. "We have time for 1 hour." Robb looked at him. Then something shifted in his face, not quite a smile. Nothing that light, but a recognition. The look of a man who remembers, briefly, that he is not entirely alone. "You left the Night's Watch," he said. "I left the Night's Watch." "They'll call it desertion." "They will." "John." 1 hour, John said. "Then you can tell me what an idiot I am while we ride." Robb was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, "Thank you." John looked at the mill wall. "Don't thank me yet. We have to survive first." He was already turning the problem over in his mind with the cold, practical part of himself that the wall had sharpened, the part that thought in terms of terrain and numbers and supply lines, rather than grief or guilt or the image of Walder Frey's satisfied wet eyes, watching his brother bleed. They were 2 men, 2 direwolves, and 2 horses in the middle of hostile riverlands, territory with Frey riders almost certainly, already ranging out from the twins. Robb's wound would slow them. The bolt had been poisoned with something that John suspected but hadn't mentioned because there was nothing to be done about it yet. A faint discoloration at the wound's edge, a slight fever already rising in Robb's skin when John had touched his forehead under the pretense of checking his color. They needed a maester. They needed allies. They needed somewhere defensible to stop and think. "The Brotherhood," Robb said suddenly, as if reading the direction of John's thoughts if not their specific contents. "Without banners. They operate through the riverlands. Beric Dondarrion." John looked at him. "You'd trust an outlaw lord?" "He fights the Lannisters," Robb said. "Right now that's recommendation enough." A pause. "And he has a red priest with him. Thoros of Myr." John thought about that. About what a red priest might know about wounds and fever and things done to a man's blood in the dark of a Frey castle. He didn't like any of the implications, but he liked the alternative less. "Do you know where they range?" he asked. Somewhere in the Kingswood margins. I had reports. Robb's jaw tightened with the effort of keeping his voice, even as his body registered what the rest of him was trying to ignore. We find them, or we go further east and look for loyal bannermen. House Mallister is still. I think Mallister is still. We find the Brotherhood first, John said. Closer. And if the Red Priest can do anything for that fever, we'll be better positioned to ride for Mallister afterward. Robb nodded once, slowly. Grey wind shifted against his legs and Robb's hand moved automatically to the direwolf's head. The hour passed in near silence, which was its own kind of conversation between brothers who had always understood each other better in the spaces between words than in the words themselves. John watched the road through a gap in the mill wall. Ghost lay across the entrance like a living barricade, chin on his forepaws, red eyes half closed. When the hour was up, John helped Robb to his feet without being asked, and Robb accepted the help without comment, and they rode east into a morning that was pale and cold and offered nothing in the way of promises. Behind them, somewhere on the river road, John could already hear the distant sound of horses, fray riders, coming fast. The North wasn't saved yet. It hadn't even begun. The Brotherhood without banners found them before they found the Brotherhood. It happened at a crossroads in the deep Riverland's interior, where 3 mud tracks met beneath an oak tree old enough to have watched the Andals arrive, its branches spreading wide and bare against the cold sky. John had his hand on Longclaw, before the first figure stepped out from the undergrowth, and Ghost was on his feet with his lips pulled back, and grey wind rose from beside Robb's horse with a growl that vibrated in the chest like a war drum. There were 12 of them, ragged men in mismatched armor, carrying weapons that had clearly been acquired rather than issued, with the particular lean and weathered look of people who had been living outside, in a war for a very long time. At their head was a man who should by any rights have been dead. John could see it in the way he moved. Something slightly wrong with the rhythm of it, like a flame that had been blown out and relit one too many times. Lord Beric Dondarrion. One eye. A scar that mapped a history of violence across his face. Beside him, a red priest in robes that had once been fine and were now merely red, watching Robb stark with an attention that was not quite clinical and not quite spiritual, but something uneasily between the two. The young wolf, Dondarrion said. His voice was mild and carrying at once. A lord's voice surviving in an outlaw's body. We heard the twins were burning. Phrase, John said, keeping his own voice flat and his hand where it was. We know whose work it is. Something moved briefly in Dondarrion's one eye, not anger exactly, but its older, colder cousin. We've been at war with the Lannisters and their allies long enough to recognize their signatures. His gaze moved to John. You're not a Stark bannerman. That's a Night's Watch sword. It was, John said. Dondarrion studied him for a moment and then, apparently, decided that the conversation was complete enough for now. He looked at Thoros. The Red Priest was already moving toward Robb's horse with the focused purposefulness of a man who has decided something is going to happen and is simply carrying it out. Your fever is visible from here, Thoros said to Robb, matter-of-factly. The wound was poisoned. Tears of lies in the bolt tip, if I had to guess. It's a Lannister preference. We need to stop and I need an hour with you. Robb looked down at him from the horse with those steady, exhausted eyes. Can you fix it? I can try, Thoros said. The Lord of Light has been generous with me lately. More than I deserve, probably. He paused. I should tell you plainly, what I do is not what a Maester does. If that troubles you, tell me now. Robb was quiet for a moment. Grey Wind had stopped growling and was watching Thoros with his head slightly tilted, which John took as a better sign than anything the priest had actually said. Do it, Robb said. They stopped in a Brotherhood camp tucked into the margin of a ruined village. 3 walls of a collapsed barn providing windbreak and concealment, with scouts posted on the approaches. John sat apart from the makeshift surgery and sharpened Longclaw methodically and watched the tree line and tried not to think about what Thoros was doing. Because the sounds and they smell of the fire and the low murmuring that might have been prayer were not things he wanted to examine too closely. Dondarrion sat beside him after a while, uninvited but not unwelcome. You rode from the wall, he said. From beyond it, John said. We were ranging. And you abandoned your ranging for your brother. Yes. Dondarrion was quiet for a moment. He had the quality of a man who had made peace with complexity. Not because complexity didn't trouble him, but because he'd had enough of it for long enough that trouble had become a kind of background noise. I've died 6 times, he said, conversationally. Each time the Lord of Lights sent me back. I've thought a great deal about what vows mean. When you've been through fire and come back from it, whether the vow you made is still owed to the institution or to the purpose behind it. John looked at him. What did you conclude? That purpose survives institutions, Dondarrion said. The Night's Watch was built to protect the realm. If the realm needs protecting down here more urgently than it does up there, perhaps your vow is intact and only the geography has changed. He paused. That may be self-serving reasoning. I've found that it usually is, when the reasoning conveniently absolves you of guilt. John almost smiled. You're not what I expected. No one is, at the end. Dondarrion rose. Your brother will live. Thoros doesn't fail at this anymore. He used to, back when he still doubted. He doesn't doubt much now. Something crossed the scarred face. Brief and unreadable. I'm not sure if that's comforting or not. Robb emerged from the makeshift surgery 2 hours later, pale and moving carefully but moving under his own power. The fever's glaze cleared from his eyes. He sat beside John and ate dried meat and hard bread with the concentrated focus of a man rebuilding himself from the inside. And John watched the camp around them, the Brotherhood's men, competent and quiet and carrying their outlawry with a kind of dignity, and felt the shape of what came next beginning to form. Mallister is at Seaguard, Robb said between bites. If he survived, and I think he survived. He wasn't at the Twins, he's still loyal. We ride for Seaguard. We have a fortress and a harbour and Mallister's men. How many? 2,000, perhaps. 3 if his called his. Banners in since the news from the south. Robb's jaw tightened. Not enough to retake the north alone. Not enough to march on the Twins. He was quiet for a moment, but enough to not be running. John thought about what he knew of the northern political situation from the fragments of news that had reached the wall. Winterfell taken and burned, supposedly by Theon Greyjoy, though the details had never sat right with him. Bran and Rickon reportedly dead. Their sisters, Sansa in King's Landing, Arya lost somewhere. The Stark family scattered across the map like pieces from an overturned board. There's something you need to know, John said. He said it carefully, the way you approach something that will hurt. About Winterfell. About Bran and Rickon. Robb went very still. The report said they were dead, John said. I don't believe it. I don't believe Theon had it in him. And I don't believe the bodies were ever confirmed. I think they ran. He paused. I think they are alive somewhere. I think the Stark children are harder to kill than anyone is accounting for. It was partly hope and partly genuine tactical assessment and partly the bone deep. Stark knowing that had sent him south in a wolf dream. And he couldn't have said which part was largest. Robb listened to all of it with his eyes on the middle distance and his hands very still in his lap. If Bran and Rickon are alive, Robb said slowly, and if Sansa can be gotten out of King's Landing. Then the Starks aren't finished, John said. Robb looked at him then, directly and fully. And what John saw in his brother's face was not hope. Exactly, hope was too light a word. For what survival looked like after the Red Wedding, but something that functioned the same way hope does, which is to say it was the thing that made the next step possible. Bolton will have reached Winterfell by now or be close to it, Robb said. He'll consolidate quickly. He's thorough. The word came out stripped of everything, except its accurate meaning. We won't get a second chance at him if we let him dig in. Then we don't let him dig in, John said. with 2,000 Mallister men and a band of outlaws. Robb said, with something. That was not quite bitterness and not quite humor, but contained elements of both. And 2 direwolves, John said. Robb looked at Grey Wind. Grey Wind looked back at him with those ancient, yellow-green eyes, steady and present and unbroken despite everything. And 2 direwolves, Robb agreed quietly. Around them, the Riverland's dusk was settling in, purple and cold, the first stars appearing above the tree line. Somewhere out in the growing dark, Frey riders were still ranging. Bolton was riding north with Lannister gold and a stolen lordship. The north was occupied and bleeding and waiting. But the young wolf was alive. And Jon Snow was beside him. And in the morning they would ride for Seaguard, with the remnants of a brotherhood at their backs. And they would begin the long and bloody business of making the north remember. They rode into Seaguard on a morning that smelled of salt and iron. Lord Jason Mallister met them at the gate himself, which told Jon everything he needed to know about the man. No intermediary, no herald, no careful political distance. He came down into the courtyard in riding clothes, with his steward scrambling behind him, and looked at Robb stark the way a man looks at something he had already begun to grieve, with the particular expression of grief. Interrupted, that is, somehow harder to witness than grief completed. "My king," he said, and went to one knee in the mud without hesitation. Behind him, his garrison followed, 200 men in the courtyard dropping to their knees in a wave, and from the walls above Jon could see the sentries doing the same, one after another, the gesture rippling outward like something dropped into still water. It was not a performance. It was a declaration, made in the presence of no audience that mattered politically, which meant it was the only kind of declaration worth anything. Robb looked at it all with those steady hollowed eyes and said, "Rise, all of you. We have work to do." The work began that same afternoon. Mallister's Maester examined. Robb's wound properly and confirmed what Thoros had already accomplished. The poison neutralized. The wound clean, healing with a speed the Maester found difficult to account for and did not press on, being a practical man. He recommended 2 weeks of rest, received Robb's polite acknowledgement, and was wise enough to understand that the acknowledgement was not an agreement. Jon spent the first day in Seaguard's war room with Robb and Mallister and Dondarrion, who had ridden with them and whose presence Mallister accepted with the careful diplomacy of a man who understood that the Brotherhood's intelligence network through the Riverlands was worth considerably more than his personal feelings about outlawry. Maps covered every surface. Robb moved through them with a focused intensity that burned off the last of the red wedding shock like morning fog, burning off water, not gone, not forgotten, but pushed down into the place where Starks keep the things that would destroy them if they carried them on the surface. The strategic situation was brutal and they did not soften it. Roose Bolton held the north with Frey support and Lannister backing. The remaining Stark bannermen were fragmented. Some had declared for Bolton out of survival. Some were waiting, some were dead. Winterfell itself was held by Bolton forces. The castle damaged from whatever had actually happened with Theon Greyjoy. A story whose real shape Jon still didn't know. The mountain passes were snowed in. "We can't take the north by force alone," Robb said on the second evening, staring at the map with his knuckles on the table and the candlelight making shadows of his face. "Not with what we have, even if every remaining loyal bannerman declares and we march with Mallisters, full strength and the Brotherhood. Bolton has the fortresses and the Frey numbers behind him. We march north. We are fighting a siege war in winter, and winter is coming hard this year." "Then we don't march north," Jon said. "Not yet." Everyone looked at him. He had been turning it over for 2 days, in the space between conversations, in the watches of the night, when he sat with Ghost on Seaguard's walls and looked out at the sea and thought the way the wall had taught him to think in terms of what the cold actually required, not what pride or grief demanded. The wall had been a brutal education in the difference between the two. "The north won't be taken from the outside," Jon said. "Not in this season, not with these numbers. But it can be lost from the inside. Bolton knows that too. It's why he'll be consolidating aggressively, pushing the remaining loyal lords to declare quickly, before word spreads that Robb survived. He looked at Robb. Word that he survived changes everything. Right now Bolton and the Freys and the Lannisters all believe. The Red Wedding finished the Starks. Every day they believe that, they get more comfortable. Every day we let them get comfortable, we lose ground. So we let them know he's alive, Mallister said slowly. We don't let them know, Jon said. We make sure every loyal house in the north knows, before Bolton can reach them. Ravens, riders, whatever it takes. Not a military declaration, not yet. A message. The king lives. Hold fast. Wait. Robb was watching him with an expression Jon couldn't quite read. And while they wait, Dondarrion asked, from the corner where he'd been listening with his one-eyed patience. While they wait, we do what Bolton won't expect, Jon said. We go to the wall. The silence in the war room had a specific quality to it. Explain, Robb said quietly. Jon straightened. The Night's Watch is politically neutral, or supposed to be, but the watch is undermanned, undersupplied, and facing something beyond the wall that makes every war down here look like a border skirmish. I've seen it. I know what's coming south, and it's coming whether or not the Boltons hold Winterfell. He paused. If Robb goes to the wall, not as a supplicant, not in retreat, but as a king honoring his duty to the realm, he gains two things. First, the moral high ground. A king who marches to defend the realm against the real threat, while Bolton plays politics in a stolen castle. Second, the wildlings. Mallister's expression shifted toward skepticism. The free folk won't fight for a southern king. They'll fight for survival, Jon said. And I know their leader. Mance Rayder. He has 100,000 people beyond the wall trying to get south ahead of what's coming. If Robb opens the gates, if the king in the north himself offers them passage in exchange for their axes when the time comes, Mance will deal. He's practical enough. He has to be. He watched the room absorb it. The silence stretched. A Stark king, Robb said slowly, coming to the wall, offering the free folk safe passage south, fighting the real war. Something was moving behind his eyes, the military mind working, but underneath it something older, something that sounded like their father. It changes the story. Bolton is holding a castle. I'm defending the kingdom. The northern lords will see it, Jon said. The ones who are waiting, who haven't declared. They'll see the difference between a man who took a castle by treachery and a man who rode to the wall, because the realm needed him there. It's a long road, Mallister said carefully, and it requires trusting that the northern lords will hold their loyalty through a hard winter. They're northerners, Robb said, with something in his voice that was not quite his old certainty, but was close enough to function as it. Holding through a hard winter is what we do. The plan took shape over the following days with the particular momentum of things that are right, not easy, not safe, but aligned with the shape of reality, in a way that made each piece fall naturally into place. Ravens went north that first night, carried by Mallister's birds. Short and careful messages to the lords. Jon and Robb both trusted most the Mormonts on Bear Island. What remained of the Umbers who hadn't broken? The mountain clans who answered to no one easily and would answer to a Stark before they answered to a Bolton. The message was the same in every case. The king lives. Hold fast. Winter is the real war. We are coming. Dondarrion took the Brotherhood back into the Riverlands with a different mission. Harassment, disruption, the particular guerrilla violence at which the outlaws excelled, directed now at Frey supply lines and communication routes, not to win a war, to make noise, to keep the Freys and Boltons looking south and inward while the real movement happened north. On the fifth morning at Seaguard, Jon found Robb on the castle's seaward wall before dawn, standing with grey wind pressed against his leg, looking out at the black water. He didn't say anything. He stood beside his brother and looked at the same water and waited. She would have hated this plan. Robb said eventually. Talisa. He said it without breaking, which was its own kind of breaking. She would have said we were being too cold about it. Too calculated. Would she have been wrong? John asked. Robb was quiet for a long time. No, he said finally. She'd have been right. And she'd have helped us do it anyway. Because she understood that being right about something doesn't always mean you get to act on it. He paused. She was smarter than me. About most things. John said nothing. Sometimes the only thing to offer is the willingness to stand in the cold beside someone while they carry something uncarryable. I'm going to take the North back, Robb said. Not fiercely. Not desperately. Quietly, the way you say something true. And then I'm going to make sure that what happened at the Twins never happens to another family. No more guest right violated. No more. He stopped. Started again. The North has to mean something. It has to be worth what it costs. It is, John said. Robb looked at him. You don't know that. No, John agreed. But I rode from beyond the wall on a wolf dream and broke my vows and killed 4 Frey soldiers in a hall full of dead men to get you out. So I'm committed to it meaning something at this point. Something shifted in Robb's face. It was not a smile. It was too worn and too earned to be a smile. But it was the first thing that had lived near warmth in his expression since the Twins. And John held onto it the way you hold onto small lights in very long darknesses. They rode north 2 days later with Mallister's 2,000 at their backs, the Brotherhood's promise of disruption behind them, and 2 direwolves running in the pre-dawn dark ahead of them like outriders, from a world that had not yet decided to give up on the Starks. The wall rose before them eventually, ancient and vast and indifferent to the politics of kings. And at its gate Jon Snow, deserter, bastard, brother, spoke to his brothers in black and told them what was coming from the north, and told them what it would cost if they faced it alone, and told them that the king in the north was here to pay the debt the realm owed the Watch before the real war began. Lord Commander Mormorn listened to all of it with the patience of a man who has stopped being surprised by the world and started being interested in it instead. Then he opened the gate. The wall had stood for 8,000 years. It had watched kingdoms rise and shatter, watched dynasties burn to nothing, watched the small fierce lives of men flicker past like sparks from a fire. It did not care about the Red Wedding. It did not care about the Boltons, or the Freys or the golden comfort of Lannister certainty. It cared about what came from the north. And what came from the north was coming regardless of who sat in whose castle. But now, for the first time in a generation, a king stood at its base who understood both truths. Simultaneously, the truth of the realm's political wounds and the truth of the existential darkness gathering beyond the ice. Robb Stark had ridden to the wall not in defeat but in the oldest tradition of northern kingship, the understanding that the land itself was the first obligation, before pride, before vengeance, before the satisfaction of settling scores. Roose Bolton held Winterfell. The Freys held the Twins. The Lannisters believed the game was won. They were wrong. In the months that followed, the northern lords who had waited, and there were more of them than Bolton had accounted for, began to move. Quietly at first, then less quietly. The story of a king who had survived the Red Wedding and ridden to defend the wall spread. Through the north the way fire spreads through dry wood, which is to say unstoppably and with its own momentum. And by the time Roose Bolton understood what was happening, the story was already larger than his ability to contain it. The north remembered. It always had. May the force be with you.